Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to the A24 project here on the Nerd Party Network. Myself and Dallas King make our way through the A24 filmography, and along the way we bring you interviews with the talent involved. In this episode we turn our attention to A24's first sequel, Joanna Hogg's The Souvenir Part 2. So Dallas, I've been saying this for a while. I caught this one, lucky enough, at the London Film Festival back in October. You finally caught it last week. I've been so excited to talk about this movie for months with someone now, and the moment has finally arrived.
I know, yeah, I've been looking forward to this one. I thought maybe around about December I might have caught it, but for some reason it keeps saying coming soon to Apple TV in the States, but at this point that date is still to be confirmed. So I had to wait all the way until February for Picture House Entertainment to release it in the UK. They released the first one, so they knew what they were doing, and I don't know if it's still the Spider-Man effect or whatever, but the Cineworlds and all that, even though they own Picture House, still weren't really willing to give up even one screen for Picture House. So I had to wait a couple of weeks extra and then catch it at my local independent cinema, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah, I've caught it a few times since then.
With one of the stars, I believe.
Yeah, Honor Swinton Byrne, Edinburgh resident, came along to one of the sort of the Q&As here. So yeah, and finally it did drop it, despite the fact that it seemed to be alluding to the fact that it would be on Apple TV Plus. It actually dropped on iTunes last week. So yeah, almost a week just behind the UK cinema release, it finally arrived sort of stateside on digital. So we've certainly had to wait a long time for a film that is pretty much as British as it comes.
And I think it's probably fair to say if A24 were ever to have done a sequel to one of their films, this was probably not the one that we were expecting.
Yeah, exactly. So let's dive into it. So, in the aftermath of her tumultuous relationship with a charismatic and manipulative older man, Julie begins to untangle her fraught love for him in making her graduation film, starting fact from fiction. So before we dive into part 2, let's take some advice from The Souvenir Part 2 and look back first. So we both watched The Souvenir together in 2019 at the Edinburgh Film Festival. What did you think of the film at the time, and has it held up since for you?
I mean, I remember liking the film. Maybe not love is the right word, but I certainly respected what it was doing. It certainly seemed to split audiences at Edinburgh. Some people raved about it. Some people just didn't really connect with it, whether it was the story or maybe the filmmaking style of it. I mean, I think I went out on our main episode where we reviewed it several years ago now, probably. I think I stated that I was confused as to the time period in which the film was set in, because I don't think initially I'd cottoned on that it was set in the 80s. I know that she's talking about doing a documentary on like Sunderland and the fallout of industry in that sort of area, but then there was a party where they were taking photos on 35mm cameras, and she was typing up her notes on a typewriter, and I thought, well, that's what hipsters do these days. Maybe it's just an aesthetic style to be filming in this slightly rainy thing, and then it's like, oh no, it is actually set in the mid '80s, because I think Anthony claims he's working in the foreign office, and at one point it mentions a big sort of factual political event, and so it was like, oh right, okay, I've got this completely wrong. But I mean, it didn't hamper my enjoyment of the film at the time, but I haven't really had the chance to go back and revisit it before this one, but it still holds a high place in the filmography. I think Honest Winterburn was great in a sort of debut. Nice to see her mum in another role, playing probably slightly older than she is, but she's playing her mum, so it's a natural fit. And yeah, I kind of liked what it was saying about the mixture between art and life, and how the two can sometimes bleed together as one.
Yeah, and that's something we'll certainly dive into too in this episode. And yeah, I was the same. I thought I'd watched it more than I had sort of the Souvenir Part 1, but I went back to my letterbox stats, and yeah, I've watched it 4 times, and one of them was only just a few weeks ago. I found it slightly frustrating that sort of Picture House Entertainment were releasing it here in the UK, and I know some cinemas have shown part one again, but it's like,
Yeah, my local independent one had it. It didn't not double feature, but it did have a couple of screenings in the week prior to it coming out as well. So there was a chance to catch up on it, but I missed my window on that one.
they should have done the kind of the Marvel.
Midnight screening.
Yeah, get there at 10 o'clock, watch the Souvenir part one, and then like the hype begins to build up and so on. And
Forget the Dark Knight midnight screenings. It's a Dark Horse screening.
yes, that's exactly it. So yeah, I'd kind of felt like I'd watched it a lot since, and part of me has maybe come to the conclusion that I've spoken about it a lot more than I've perhaps watched it. Kind of since we've had a previous interview episode about sort of the movie. We did our A24 project review all the way back when, and then sort of rewatched it soon. And it's just been a film that's kind of lived in my head since. I think it's one of those ones I think you kind of highlight. It really split audiences. You either kind of loved it, or you just thought it was something that was incredibly pretentious. And yeah, I was certainly on the side that I really adored it. I just thought the performances were so strong. That central relationship was so gripping. And I think it was almost watching it thinking, right, how do you follow up a sort of a film like this? And you're watching for that kind of nuggets of thinking, oh, I wonder if they're going to go down this route, or it's going to be something so different, or is it going to be like a before trilogy style thing where it cuts to every sort of 10 years as we kind of follow Julie and kind of her story. So yeah, that was always there for me. But before we even sort of dive into the film, what did you think about it being a sequel to the film, and what were your kind of expectations going in? Because it's something that we all knew from day one was coming. I remembered sitting watching that first film with you, and we knew there was a sequel coming, and I never realized it until I think when I rewatched it recently, I just sort of had the credits kind of rolling in the background because I liked the score, and it says at the end, coming soon, sort of in a James Bond style way of like the Souvenir Part 2. So it was always kind of due to happen. But how did you feel about a sequel?
I mean, admittedly, I was skeptical at first. It was like, huh, okay, but then I think it's safe to say that in my head, where I thought the film was going to go was kind of where they did go with it. I mean, given that Julie is a documentary filmmaker, it was a natural leap, I think, that she would look to process her thoughts and her pain around this central relationship by exploring it through the medium of film and basically making a film about it in order her own personal way of trying to deal with it, even though that basically involves bearing her entire soul to several people that she's working with and stuff like that. So I think it was a natural place to go. I admire the sort of technique behind it. Whether or not it's entirely successful, I guess that's what we'll probably get into.
Yeah, I was excited for a sequel because it was like, as we mentioned, this is sort of the first A24 sequel, so there's kind of a bit of a novelty to that one. And, ultimately I trust someone like Joanna Hogg, where you kind of see or hear about some films where they're going to make a sequel to this film, and your immediate reaction is like, of course they're going to make it. It's made so much money. They're just looking to kind of milk a franchise to death. Oh, it's another IP. I mean, you think of something like whether it's like a Free Guy, they hype up, oh, it's this original film, and it's kind of an antithesis to all these sorts of things. And then it's like, then it gets a sequel because it's popular. Like, no one is ever having those conversations surrounding kind of the Souvenir, or, even when conversations go for something like the Before trilogy, people are like, oh, but they wouldn't do it if they didn't have something to say. And that's the key thing. I think there is something to be said here. And, one thing that also got me really excited about a sequel was obviously Robert Pattinson was heavily linked, and even due to star in the film for a period of time until he had to withdraw due to sort of
Batman reshoots.
was it not the Tenant reshoots that kind of delayed it? I think it was, because I think, he did that, and then obviously I think Batman came along, so the window just completely shut. But I don't know about you, but it was impossible not to watch that movie for the first time and think, that guy was meant to be Robert Pattinson, and watch the scenes thinking, oh, I wonder if we would have got Robert Pattinson in this scene, for example.
Yeah, no, it was watching it. It's like because I believe that his part was actually then he's so good that he had to be replaced by two people. They basically kind of rewrote his part into two separate parts, and yeah, I could see exactly, like you say, which parts were going to be him. It would have been difficult to see how those two would have blended together because they are quite distinctly opposite in terms of the way that they interact with Julie. But I could definitely have seen him in the first role.
Yeah, I think that was very much the role I also thought he was going to be. But, kind of diving into the film now, with what we actually did get, there was an immediate line from, I think another thing that got me excited for the sequel was like, it's whenever you make a sequel, you always go like, what was popular with the first one, and you give us a little bit more of that. And that was obviously Richard Ayoade as Patrick. So we kind of got something like that where he had this brilliant line where kind of Julie is looking to kind of explore sort of the reasons behind her sort of partner's death, and was he a junkie, did he work for the Foreign Office, and so many kind of unknown questions. And he poses a sort of challenge to her as a sort of filmmaker, where it was just something so simple where it's like, build a memorial to him. And on my kind of first viewing and then repeated viewings, I think that's something that's incredibly powerful, and it's something that we often will try to do in sort of our kind of day-to-day lives. You always think of it if you lose a grandparent or a family member. You often hear about people that do something that would make them proud in terms of how you live your life, conduct yourself, the type of person you are. But there's something very powerful about when you build that kind of memorial in terms of art, music, film. It becomes forever, and it's something that people can truly kind of relate to or pull from. And I think the way that kind of the film looked at that, I found that incredibly powerful, because it's just thinking about that, just that simple line. And so many films we've watched have examined that and have been memorials to those that have been lost, or terrible experiences that people have gone through.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues that sort of Julie has to confront with this is that by making a film and sort of putting it out there into the world, it's then not just about her experience. It then becomes everyone else's, because everyone, as we're doing now, we're critiquing and reviewing a film. We've got opinions on what everything means, and everyone else who watches her finished film will have an opinion on it and what it meant, whether it's her friends or family, or even like Anthony's family when they see it. What will they make of it? And yeah, and it's quite clear to her friends who are all these students who are working on it. This is from what it seems, quite clearly a last minute change from this documentary that she was going to be making into this apparently sort of avant-garde love story that breaks all the narrative rules, doesn't have shot lists and stuff like that, something which apparently has affected another A24 list, if I'm reading the reports correctly about Sam Levinson and Euphoria. So yeah, it's an interesting technique in way that it looks at it, but yeah, it's something that will not just be hers, it will be something that everyone will ultimately have an opinion on as well.
The one thing that surprised me about the film, and I don't think anyone saw coming until I think the film first aired at Cannes last year, and there was a topic that kind of came out where there was, the early reviews were really good. Seeing people saying it was better than the first. You always take film festival reactions with a pinch of salt. I've certainly been guilty of hyperbole after seeing a film kind of early or in that kind of environment. But the key word that came out of it was that this is a very meta sequel to the Souvenir, which kind of caught me off guard. And I read sort of some press notes that called the film a deconstruction of a reconstruction. So obviously the first part, as we know, was sort of based on sort of Joanna Hogg's, a relationship that she went through was pretty much identical to this. It was a bit of a sort of a life story take from her. But, how we were always wondering what would they do sort of next, but that deconstruction of a reconstruction and this meta approach certainly had me kind of curious going in. But what did you think when you'd heard sort of it was going to be a meta take for the sequel, and what was your kind of reaction to how it was done?
Yeah, when it sort of said that it was a meta take, I then, that's where I sort of instantly was assuming that okay, it's basically, so she's almost going to be remaking scenes from the first film for her own film. So I thought there was going to be a lot of sort of repetition, but then maybe potentially seeing the same scenes from different sides or different emotional perspective and stuff like that. So that the kind of stuff I was excited to see. Um, I mean, at certain times it maybe does get maybe sort of slightly confusing. I noticed there was several different sort of interesting techniques, and I don't know if you picked up on this sort of, but there's certain scenes that look exactly like the original, are clearly sort of potentially filmed with on 35mm or with a certain sort of stock or filter to make it look sort of period and authentic from the 80s. But then there was like, I think there's one certain scene in the middle where Richard Otherway's Patrick is there, is sort of shouting at his editor and stuff like that. What does it make you feel and stuff like that? And it looked very crisp and clean, like it had been shot on digital. And I was like, oh, visually it was quite striking and how different it was to what we'd seen before. And then there was a few other scenes later on which had a similar thing, and then it sort of does okay, so what was the meaning of that? And so I start now what does that mean? Why has she chosen that particular sort of camera look and shooting style for these scenes compared to the other ones? And then you've got a similar technique to the end of the film, where in the end of the first film she's watching them sort of filming something, and then she looks to the camera and then she sort of exits via a soundstage, where it was like breaking the sort of almost fourth wall, the artifice of, well, was the entire thing a film? And that was her, I guess, at the end of the first film I wondered if the entire sequence was basically her interpretation of what that relationship had been, but she'd made it for the film. But it's clear now that she is making the film in the part two. But I did wonder if there was something meant by that, because there's a similar moment at the end of the film, which I won't spoil, but it does make you question a lot of what you've seen before, potentially.
Yeah, like I think we won't certainly touch on that final shot, but it's again, there's so many conversations that you can have about that film when it ends. But yeah, like it is an interesting kind of film that, Joanna Hogg is making a movie about her younger self, making a movie also about her younger self's kind of their biggest heartbreak, which in the second movie, which is effectively a remake of the kind of the previous movie. And it's one of those ones, the amount of detail and how personal this film is, I love that about the film. I was at a Q&A sort of session with Honor Swinton Byrne, and she was speaking about how I never realized this. I perhaps haven't maybe read as much of the behind the scenes as I could have, and we'll maybe touch on this in a forthcoming interview if I can tease that. But that there was a script, but the script was basically like certain scenes, and everything in this script essentially was improvised. And it was very similar to a show like Curb Your Enthusiasm. You kind of want to get to sort of from point A to point B in the scene, but how you get there is up to you. But Honor Swinton Byrne's character was very much kind of out of the loop, that she wasn't really kind of given a script. She would be sort of dropped into scenes, and her sort of real life reactions to some of these other characters that were very much in the loop, especially when you think of sort of the drug abuse kind of side. I thought that made it kind of really interesting, and it certainly plays up on that. You often see it with Byrne's portrayal of Julie, where Julie is kind of a bit flummoxed or shocked and surprised by things. She's not always in on the full loop. She didn't even sort of realize that when she was making the first movie that sort of Tom was going to die, until sort of they did the sort of the final section of the film, which was just incredible. I'm really desperate to learn more about that kind of making of process, and hopefully we can share that with you soon. But I thought that was just kind of incredible. And she spoke about how she'd read through sort of like Hogg's kind of diaries about sort of the time, just kind of going into sort of that experience. I imagine, for someone like Honor Swinton Byrne, who's like Joanna Hogg's like goddaughter, and you even see the two of them, like when you see Swinton Byrne in kind of day-to-day life, she looks very different from kind of the, this sort of Norwich-based kind of Julie. She seems very cool, very trendy, quite aloof and fun of herself. Whereas you see Julie and she looks like a younger Joanna Hogg. It's uncanny. And I find that interaction between the two of them just so fascinating, between Byrne and Hogg. I think you could write a book about that.
Yeah, no, and sort of learning that sort of behind the scenes thing, it does kind of make sense sort of looking back on certain scenes, and I guess it sort of increases that thing of what I was saying about how in the process of making the film, it doesn't become just her story; it becomes everyone else's, because there's like scenes where the actors are putting their own spin on the characters, and she seems slightly sort of hesitant to it, where it's like, well, no, that's not actually what happened. I know what happened. I was there and stuff like that. So, and if her being able to be, yeah, like it sort of adds to that, and it probably also adds to the potential then real life frustrations of the the cameraman, the director of cinematography, who was, yeah, I expect that's a scene that just happened on many a student and regular film, where just changing your idea of what you want to do last minute and becoming so frustrated that you spent hours setting up the lighting for one particular shot, and then she decides that actually the scene's set at night time, and he just like is ready to sort of walk from the production. And yeah, I can imagine that her sort of umming and ahhing in that scene, because she's not, got a script to work from. Then that just sort of added to that sort of powder keg of situation.
Yeah, and I think what I love about this second movie and kind of the journey Julie goes on is that it sort of makes you reconsider the whole first film, because I think when you watch that first film, it is obvious that he is a drug issue, and there's a line where sort of Patrick at the dinner party of like, the how, the what, he's clearly a junkie, she is certainly not. How does that sort of two work? And she seems kind of a bit surprised and shocked by that. And when you kind of realize sort of how they made it, that shock and surprise is kind of real. And I love how sort of like Julie is sort of going through and deconstructing, her experience. And isn't that something that we've all gone through, where you see it with certain films where it leads more into sort of the drama of it all, whether it's something like a kind of Gone Girl, or, even an Under the Silver Lake to an extent, about, we had this relationship, no matter how brief, but what was actually kind of going on the full time. And, that's something I think is universal, that often in relationships, whether it's with the people we're married to, lovers, flings, we don't ever really know the full story of what's going on the other side. And that makes it very difficult and painful to get over. You might have someone that's in your life for such a short period of time, and they leave and you're surprised what happened. You're trying to process that. But then you can also have someone that you've been with for years and intimate with, and you're like, oh, they've gone. How did they get to that point? What was their surprise and secret? There's only so many of the hours of the day that we can be with people, and I find that interesting. When you go back, even as a fan of the first film, to watch that, you can see sort of the why Julie would be so surprised, and does he actually work in the Foreign Office? A different day from now, when you could probably find out that information through LinkedIn. There's so many kind of questions that can be asked, and it forces you to think about your own experience, and what surprised you and left you heartbroken when someone left, through either the end of a relationship or through someone's death, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think he potentially could have worked at the Foreign Office, seeing certain things going around about current governments and whatever. I could fully, understand that there would be a high functioning, addict working in the highest reaches of government. I think they know how to cover it up, and he clearly is a master of being able to manipulate her and lie to her and keep this facade going. So if he could do it for her, I'm sure he could have done it in his workplace as well. But it's a difficult one, isn't it? About when you are left with that sort of shock and stuff like that. About she does have a couple of scenes where she goes to the parents' house. She meets someone who appears to be like a drug dealer or something like that, and you're looking to get answers, but then it's like, how far down that rabbit hole do you go? Do you really want to know the truth and potentially find out just how awful a person he was, or is it better to try and keep some of the nicer memories alive? And I think that's kind of what she battles in during making the filming, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting kind of point where it comes back to Patrick again. This he is a real asshole at points, but he has a way with words when it matters. As we get towards the end of the film, and she's still exploring kind of what happened, and he simply says he was a junkie. That was it, and it's not something I can relate to, but you read enough, whether it's in the news or biographies or in films, that you see that there's so many so much shame, a double life, with these people, and in a way that's all you need to know about that person's story. That you can get all the details you need, but in a way that just answers the entire question.
Yeah, no, it's like yeah, she's looking for answers, but he just sums it up in one word, which is, if people, if it was in the newspapers, whatever, that's what the story would probably lead with, is, drug overdose, junkie, whatever, forgetting all the other things. He's basically been, defined by this one particular thing. And yeah, it certainly seems that Patrick knew him better than Julie ever did. But it was a delight to see him back in not one but two but three different scenes, which was lovely. And that lovely I think my favorite scene is probably that scene in the middle where he's just like he's just screaming at the air, what does it make you feel? And he's like, what is it? It's great. And he's great. No, you can say that about anything. I need specific details and stuff like that. And it's probably something that us film critics and reviewers are guilty of. Is we can say a film's great, but we need to dig just that little bit deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of those ones, I think, was an actress, we've spoken a little bit about this. I think Honor Swinton Byrne just knocks it out the park again. And when I was at that kind of Q&A, and if you're anyone that's seen these two movies, you're like, why isn't I haven't seen her in more things? She's a really incredible young talent. I'm sure we'll see her on the BAFTA Rising Star nominations list in about 15 years, kind of knowing their reputation. But I discovered that she's actually a student here in Edinburgh, that she's someone that's actually studying like kind of psychology, and she might do some film stuff, but that's not necessarily her kind of goal. Obviously she kind of got roped into this film quite short notice, but she's a university student. It'll be interesting to kind of see how she navigates that career, because I think she's such an exciting talent.
I think good for her. I think it's good to have something to fall back on if acting doesn't work out, and no, I think it's good that these younger stars are taking some time out to get a backup plan going and stuff like that, just in case this whole acting thing goes sideways. So I think just do university, come in. I mean, Natalie Portman, she went to Harvard, came back, and then did the Star Wars movies, but then took a bit more time off and came back and won an Oscar for Black Swan. So I guess we'll have to figure out what Honor Swinton Byrne's Black Swan is going to be.
Yeah, I also found it quite odd that she's obviously a student at Edinburgh University, which is where my office is based. I don't necessarily work for the university, but I work on the campus. I know, that's that moment of like, I've never thought, like, you never think when we watch these movies of like, oh, there's gonna be a day I'm gonna be just stood next to Andrew Garfield or Robert Eggers or Florence Pugh when I'm getting a tea at my workplace.
Hey, Jack Lowden and Saoirse Ronan in a bros bagel.
Yeah, exactly. Lady Bird, I've seen her for a bagel, but there's that moment of like, I realize my world might come into contact with her, which made me chuckle.
Keep your microphone with you at all times and try and get a couple-minute coffee candid interview.
Exactly. I can really impress her when I book out a conference suite on the campus.
Flex those corporate muscles.
There was a great moment as well where in the sort of the Q&A, and again, this is why I've watched the film twice. I'm keen to see it again, which basically means I'm waiting for it to reduce from $15 to maybe about $8 on iTunes. But it was always I was a little confused about in the film. Obviously at the beginning she's like, oh, I've missed my period, and she implies that she's pregnant, for example. But yeah, throughout the film and through a period of time she continues to be sick, and we're kind of wondering, is she pregnant? Kind of what's kind of going on here? But it's never really answered. And what it kind of came out was that actually it was bulimia that Julie, the character, is kind of going through, and that was actually another thing that sort of Joanna Hogg kind of went through with her kind of own story as well. So again, I think hopefully people that are listening to this, I know it's sort of perhaps one of the more overlooked kind of A24 kind of films. It doesn't sort of have the impact of some of the other ones, but there's so much to mine from this movie and that, and even little things like that where you'd never pick up on your first time or your second time, but it's just when someone tells you, oh yeah, this was what that actually potentially was, it kind of answers some questions and forces you to kind of go back and reconsider it again, much like Julie is doing with the first film.
Unfortunately, yeah, it is the standard sort of movie shorthand that if a woman is sick, it normally means that she's pregnant, similar to the way that if somebody coughs, it normally means they're going to die. But yeah, no, there was that sort of thing where she says, at the beginning she's on her period and has that rather explicit bed sheet after a night of passion. So yeah, I was wondering if it was more of a either just a nervous sort of trauma-induced thing, or if there was like an eating disorder or something, because it did feel very similar to scenes that were in Spencer, which dealt with that recently as well. But I need to know. I need to know because you probably would have seen it with a packed audience. I saw it with a few people in my audience, but it did definitely deliver one of the biggest shock and sort of audible gasps I've heard in quite a long time. I'm just wondering if a scene involving a mantelpiece and an item of crockery managed to deliver a similar shock to your audience.
100% and so on. Even though I'd seen it before, I was still kind of, that moment, like, take Uncut Gems, spoilers for Uncut Gems, how he dies at the end, and when you watch the film on repeat, with an audience, you're kind of watching their reaction. I didn't anticipate I would be kind of looking around the room, kind of like, oh, there was such a kind of, you could just feel people's frustration and surprise with a moment like that. I thought that was great. Very British audience for that, I think.
It was, yeah, it's such like a simple, like almost, offhand sort of set up like a couple of scenes earlier, and then just this moment, I just found myself, I was like, oh my god. I was just like, I couldn't believe it. And sort of looking at it is like, it's the kind of thing which, even though it must have been like practice or something, it just felt so. It felt accidental, and I would have loved to have actually, been able to ask about that scene in case it was an accident, and they just went, keep rolling. Let's see what we can do with this. I don't know.
Yeah, I would also want to give a shout out to one of the greatest transition moments in an A24 film that I've ever seen, and each time I see it, I'm like, wow, they really did that. Do you know the one I'm talking about, Dallas?
No, set the scene, just tease it for a minute.
So, Julie has just had some fantastic kind of a booty call in the evening, and she mentions, we come back to this word again. I think it's the most we've ever mentioned on this podcast. She's on her period, but makes no difference to this young guy, and they proceed to have sex. And then as he leaves, she returns to her bedroom and she sees the period blood on the bed and all that sort of stuff. And then it sort of transitions into a red car that we see sort of on a filming lot, which is kind of like, oh, I didn't anticipate that sort of thing ever kind of happening in a Joanna Hogg movie, but I really, really like that. I thought
Bold
that was quite an
filmmaking
impressive one.
choices.
Yes,
I like it.
bold. Yeah, maybe Dario Argento, I can imagine making a red transition like that, but perhaps not Joanna Hogg.
And then there's an entire essay into what does the red car mean. Yes, yeah. So I mean, I want to ask about the finished short film, her short film, which is called, unsurprisingly, The Souvenir, because we see her making the film, of course, the course of the film, awkward, but then when it's finally presented at the end of year sort of gala presentation, um, it's not the film which I was expecting. It's something completely different, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on what you made of that particular piece of filmmaking, and also what do you think it meant in terms of what we receive as her love letter to Auntie is something completely different to what we thought that she was making.
So I wish I could say this is, all comes from us being like really detailed research people that spend time diving into kind of interviews and podcasts and audio commentaries and stuff.
Is this just something from the Q&A again?
This is something from the Q&A. So yeah, that was also a question I had, and I didn't ask it on the day, but someone did. And basically again we go further kind of meta into this deconstruction, where that was almost shot for shot, obviously not taking in Tom Burke and Honor Swinton and Tilda Swinton, but that was pretty much Joanna Hogg's graduation movie that she made, obviously a movie about sort of her experience that she went through, and that was pretty much exactly it, almost shot for shot. And I like that as well, where it poses a lot of questions, where if you take the film as completely literal, that is not the film they make. And again, Patrick, with whatever few lines he has, says something profound, and it's like, make this kind of memorial to him. But he also says about like, surprise them, do something unexpected. And while we sort of see very much scenes from the first movie kind of acted out, what we end up kind of seeing in the the finished feature is something completely different to that.
Yes,
So
that's what he said. Was he says, "Did you resist the temptation to be obvious?" And she went, "Yes." And he went, "Well, that's all you can do, isn't it?" So yeah, it certainly wasn't the obvious choice.
yeah, because you kind of watch it the first time, you go, oh, this isn't what we were watching, and there was no allusion to that, or set design things, and it's almost one of those ones. It pulls the rug from out of the audience, because as you say, it's not obvious, it surprises, and when you kind of then further have the context of what was behind it, again, it makes it all the more interesting, and primes you almost for a third watch.
Yeah, and I guess maybe a surprise cameo, perhaps, in that particular film. But yeah, sort of seeing that, and then seeing the scenes that come after, and the way that Joanna Hogg ends it on, which is it's just got a similar feel to a short film, The Human Voice, that starred Tilda Swinton by Pedro Almodovar, which is entirely shot on a soundstage and stuff like that. And the way that one ends, it kind of has a similar thing where, again, it's sort of breaking the artifice between the work of art and the audience, and what it all means. And yeah, it's incredibly bold, and it's certainly, whether you love or hate the filmmaking style and the story and stuff like that, I think it's impossible not to come out of it asking these sort of questions, and asking people who also saw what they thought of it and what it all meant. And I guess that's encouraging conversation about cinema is always good.
So to take a really deep layered discussion about what cinema is, and ultimately ask one of the most basic, dullest questions you can ask about movies, what was your favourite part, one or two?
I think at the moment it's part one. I wasn't completely taken with part two when I watched it, but then again, maybe it's because it did things that I wasn't expecting, because I built in my head that we were just going to get this remake of the first film, but from her perspective while she's making another film. But then, yeah, I think talking about it with you, I'm kind of more keen to give it a rewatch and see where it sits. But at the moment, I think I'm part one, then part two. But on a rewatch, it could all change until we get to part three, where she's remaking the remake of the remake.
For me, part one edges it. I think two is such a fantastic film to I've really enjoyed diving into it today, even things like the Q&A, learning more about sort of the film. But for me, the fact that the first part has this incredible kind of central pairing of kind of Tom Burke and Honor Swinton, I just that's slightly lacking in this film. I felt like it just needed something like that in it, which it never was going to, but that was what made part one and I say that as if there was much difference. I mean, I look at my ratings for it, I would have given the Souvenir part 2 a 4 out of 5, but I gave Souvenir part 1 a 4.5. So for me, it's thin margins, but one edges it. And as I say, I'm genuinely gutted that they didn't do a sort of a double feature in the cinemas. I know the A24 screening room did that, which would have been quite fun. But I just felt like, if you own a chain of cinemas, go do it. I would have paid the money to do something like that, or even just do it as an evening one-off screening on a Tuesday. So yeah, I'm looking forward to buying it down the line, and kind of maybe doing that in my own home.
Yeah, and when they present the Souvenir Part 3, and then they can do a sort of 8 p.m. then 10 p.m. into the midnight screening. That's when we get the Joanna Hogg Souvenir cinematic universe. That's when it will all come together.
Absolutely. So we're gonna, as we mentioned, sort of on our last podcast, we're sort of on a bit of a run at the moment of some really interesting kind of A24 reviews that will be coming out. On top of that, we've got Red Rocket next week, so we'll be back again for that. And then following up that, we'll have Euphoria season 2, which at the time this episode drops, the finale will have just dropped as well.
And then we're going to have X as well. I've got confirmation that it's Entertainment Film will be releasing that on the 18th of March. So we've got another one to look forward to as well.
There we go. So hopefully they do a better job of releasing that than they did the Green Knight when they decided to.
Oh yes, of course. I fully expect by the time we get to the Red Rocket episode, it'll have been delayed by a month or even a year.
Yeah, we've gone from having sporadic podcasts to non-stop A24 reviews. So hopefully you'll continue to join us in the coming weeks. And it won't be a shock to anyone that follows me on social media. The Red Rocket was my favourite film of last year, so I'm getting to rewatch it next week after watching the new Batman movie. So hopefully it still holds up. But another one I'm looking forward to talking about with you next week.
Absolutely looking forward to it.
Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week for Red Rocket.